She ripped his first-class boarding pass in half, right there in front of everyone. "You don't belong here," Harriet Stone snapped, her voice cold as steel. The 13-year-old boy stood frozen, tickets shredded, as the cabin fell into stunned silence. "Tell us where you're watching from, because in just minutes, $1.7 billion will freeze." No one moved. No one spoke. All anyone could do was watch him stand his ground. A hush settled over Gate 28. At Denver International Airport, morning light spilled through vast windows, casting long beams onto the polished floor. The first-class boarding area buzzed with early commute chatter, whispers about conference calls, murmurs of last-minute emails. But the moment Harriet Stone tore that pass in half, everything shrank into a single frame of shock. Harriet Stone, 47, lean, hair pulled into a precise bun, wore her uniform like armor. As Flight 4582 to Washington, D.C. prepared to board, she had a clipboard in one hand and a gaze that brooked no nonsense. She scanned the line of business travelers, government aides, and a handful of scholarship recipients. When she saw Caleb Thornhill step forward wearing a simple hoodie and carrying a worn backpack, her practiced smile vanished. His ticket was legitimate. Caleb's grandfather, former Governor George Thornhill of Nebraska, had insisted the boy ride first class so he could prepare for the National Youth Forum in D.C. It wasn't a courtesy. They'd paid in full. But Harriet treated his youth like a flaw to be corrected. With a swift, decisive motion, she ripped the pass. Silence rippled out. A silver-haired businessman gasped, clutching his coffee. A woman nearby gasped, clutching her pearls. A flight attendant halfway down the jet bridge froze, mouth agape. Caleb's heart slammed in his chest, but he didn't move. He slid his hands into the pockets of his jeans, grounding himself with a steady inhale. "Please step aside," Harriet said, voice flat. "This cabin isn't for children." He didn't flinch. "I have a valid first-class seat," he replied softly, voice steady even though his knees threatened to buckle. He'd practiced staying calm, just as his grandfather taught. In his mind, he replayed those lessons. Stand tall, speak truth, but never raise your voice. Harriet's lips curled in irritation. "You'll find a seat in economy. We have an empty row back there." The businessman spoke up. "That boy paid for this seat. There has to be a mistake." Harriet zigzagged her gaze through the assembled passengers. "It's not a mistake. Minors aren't permitted to travel alone in first class. Protocol requires." "He's traveling for a state-sponsored program," Caleb said. "My grandfather booked this seat so I could work on my presentation." A murmur ran along the line. Caleb glanced at the other faces. A young marketing executive, a retired Army colonel, a white-collar executive checking his tie. They all watched, curious, unsettled. One by one, they tapped recordings on their phones, sensing something extraordinary. Harriet's eyes flashed. "This is not a negotiation. Move along, please." Some passengers shuffled forward, but a handful lingered to watch. Caleb drew a quiet breath, then tapped the screen of his phone. He opened the ClearFly Anchor app, a digital key to the National Passenger Trust Index. Only someone with his ClearFly delegate credentials, granted by his grandfather, could activate the next step. He didn't have to raise his voice. His thumb hovered over Authorize. Harriet stomped closer, two uniformed security officers trailing behind. Officer Brent Taylor, a broad-shouldered man with a cropped haircut, rested a hand near his belt. Caleb's pulse spiked. He slid an earbud in and tapped, "Call Governor Thornhill." On speakerphone, a calm voice answered, "This is Governor Thornhill. Who am I speaking with?" "Grandpa." Caleb's voice was firm. "It's me, Caleb. I need code 77. In the first-class cabin, gasps trembled from passengers on board. Harriet's face paled. She took a half-step back. Officer Taylor's jaw clenched. The entire cabin fell utterly silent. "Activate," came Governor Thornhill's steady reply. 47 seconds later, alarms blared in the tap rooms of 3 major airlines. Screens in the gate areas flickered red. Pilots on 152 flights received urgent alerts. Hold position. Await ethics verification. Across half the country, flight paths returned to their gates or hovered on runways. Denver, Chicago, Atlanta. Control towers paused to reroute. Inside the jet, Harriet's mouth hung open. Taylor's stance crumbled. Men and women in business attire stared, mouths agape. Caleb stood tall, blinked once, and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He didn't grin. There was no celebration in his eyes. He simply allowed the charged hush to fill the cabin. The jet bridge door closed, muffling the commotion of displaced flights. Flight 4582 compressed into ordered calm. Harriet swallowed hard, checking her badge. Taylor blinked, uncertain how to enforce any protocol. We need to clear the way," Harriet finally managed. She stepped aside, glaring at Caleb as though he'd shattered her entire world. He met her gaze without flinching. "Your seat," he said, voice quiet. "Let's proceed." Passengers parted on either side, breathing as though released from a trap. A middle-aged woman pulled off her gloves, repeating, "I can't believe my eyes." A bespectacled man behind her adjusted his tie, as if willing to see another world. The retired colonel offered a hesitant nod of respect. Caleb moved down the jet bridge, every footstep echoing in his mind. Once inside the cabin crew members exchanged nervous glances. A young attendant named Carlos gave Caleb a small approving nod. He ushered the boy toward 1C, his window seat, making sure no one tried to stop him. Caleb slid into the plush leather chair and buckled in. Harriet hovered in the aisle, whispering to Taylor. He shook his head. There was nothing they could do. Caleb exhaled slowly. He tapped his grandfather's number again. "Thank you," he whispered before hanging up. He stared out the window at the terminal lights, at taxiways alive with grounded planes. In the distance, screens blinked a warning message. National Passenger Trust Index engaged. Flight attendants straightened uniforms. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, we're experiencing an unexpected delay. We'll advise you shortly." No one dared protest. The narrative had shifted. In that moment, 13 feet down the aisle, a boy in a hoodie commanded more power than any of the adults in business suits. It wasn't arrogance. It was the quiet strength of someone who knew his worth and refused to surrender. And as Flight 4582 eventually lifted off, the cabin held a new sense of tension laced with awe. Somewhere in Nebraska that morning, Governor Thornhill sipped his coffee, listening to the news feed broadcast the story in real time. His grandson had learned the most important lesson. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. When the system finally acknowledged him, the entire aviation network had no choice but to listen. The engines hummed beneath Caleb as he settled into his window seat. Through the cabin's small oval window, the curvature of the tarmac glowed under Denver's early sunlight. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a steady breath. The thunder of startled passengers still echoed in his mind. But here, at 35,000 feet, the world felt momentarily paused. Caleb Thornhill had never imagined he'd command this kind of attention. At 13, he'd always been quiet, someone who preferred to listen rather than speak. Back home in Lincoln, Nebraska, his afternoons often revolved around the tall bookshelves lining his grandfather's study. The late afternoon sun cutting through dust motes as Governor George Thornhill combed through policy briefs. Caleb would perch on the edge of his desk chair, scribbling notes about economic models or the ethical implications of automation in agriculture. His grandfather would glance over, nodding approval, but rarely offering more than a gentle reminder. Facts matter more than noise. He opened his eyes and glanced around first class. The leather seats were wide and forgiving, the cabin crew efficiently clearing the service carts. Most passengers avoided his gaze now, casting furtive glances instead, some wary, others curious. In the very back of his mind, he recognized a sense of unease. He was a living proof that privilege and accountability could collide in a single moment. Back in Lincoln, his routines had been simpler. Weekends meant visits to small-town diners with his grandfather, peppery eggs and toast soldiers served on blue ceramic plates, followed by long walks through the Nebraska State Capitol grounds. It was there he learned how government could feel both vast and intimate, a stanchion holding together sprawling systems, yet composed of individuals with faces and stories. He'd often overheard citizens lamenting slow processes or bureaucratic red tape, but his grandfather would remind him, systemic change begins with understanding, not frustration. Caleb's mother had died when he was 9, a loss so abrupt that it had left him adrift. His father was serving overseas with the U.S. Army, stationed somewhere beyond his reach. So, responsibility fell to his grandfather, both as guardian and mentor. Governor Thornhill had taken it upon himself to instill in Caleb a sense of moral clarity. At night, they'd debate questions of right and wrong. Was it better to break a rule for a bigger cause? Did silence equal approval, or was it sometimes a strategic choice? Those late-night talks, lamps flickering against stackable policy journals, shaped Caleb's sense of self far more than any classroom lecture. When the Nebraska Youth Forum application arrived in the mail, Caleb had stared at the parchment-quality envelope for days before deciding to apply. It was more than a scholarship opportunity to Harvard's youth leadership camp. It was a chance to represent his community on a national stage. He'd prepared by memorizing statistical data on youth voter registration in rural districts, drafting a policy brief on education funding inequities, and compiling quotes from Abraham Lincoln to highlight the state's heritage of justice. His grandfather had watched, smiling quietly, before placing a hand on his shoulder and saying, "You're ready." As the plane climbed above the Rocky Mountains, Caleb scrolled through photos in his mind. Last summer's chess tournament at Lincoln's Community Center, where he'd beaten opponents twice his age. The library, where he'd built a small mentoring circle for younger kids struggling with reading. And the nights spent coding in his makeshift home office, developing a prototype app to help local farmers monitor crop yields. He'd earned a perfect 4.0 GPA, a handful of science fair awards, and 2 provisional patents for Nebraska Harvest Predictor. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the quiet gravity of being taken seriously, and the sudden collision with Harriet Stone had reminded him that most of the world still expected children to shrink away. A soft chime from his phone cut through his thoughts. He swiped open the ClearFly Anchor app. The interface was simple, a deep blue background, the words, "National Passenger Trust Index," shining in white. His profile photo, a picture of him standing beside his grandfather at a Capitol event, hovered in the top corner. Below it, a single button read, "Request Authorization." Right now, that button was grayed out, locked until his grandfather's final command activated it. He tapped the icon anyway, fingers brushing against the glass as if it could spring to life with a new initiative of software upgrades. He remembered the day his grandfather had handed it to him, pressing the small card into Caleb's palm. "Consider this a toolkit," Governor Thornhill had said. "Not a gift, an obligation. If you ever see injustice in the air or on the ground, you have both the right and the responsibility to act. This system is fragile, and you're one of the few who can keep it honest." Caleb tapped the edge of his phone. He was still the only person on this aircraft beneath 18 who had that level of access. Most adults had no idea such a tool existed, let alone that a child could wield it. The realization made his chest tighten. He slid his phone into his hoodie pocket, heart settling into a steady rhythm. He hadn't acted to punish. He'd acted to preserve integrity. A soft knock at his armrest drew his attention. It was Carlos, the young flight attendant from earlier, leaning in with a sympathetic nod. "Mr. Thornhill, can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" Caleb shook his head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." He offered a brief, polite smile. Carlos returned it, then moved on with his service cart. The older passengers, sensing a shift, resumed polite conversation, though many kept their voices low, as if afraid to disturb the fragile equilibrium Caleb had established. He leaned back against the padded seat, closing his eyes again. Images from the past 24 hours played on an endless loop. Harriet's cold expression, the moment his ticket tore, and the hush of the cabin as he made that fateful call. Fear had come and gone in a heartbeat, replaced by something stronger, an unexpected calm. He felt as though every precise lesson his grandfather had ever taught him coalesced in that single, suspended moment. In the seat before him, a man in a tailored navy suit leaned toward the window to discreetly record a video with his phone. Caleb didn't flinch. Now that the National Passenger Trust Index was active, the suit's lapel pin with the insignia of Atlantic Global Airways was all the evidence needed. The policy hadn't been fully implemented nationwide yet, but today it functioned perfectly, swiftly, and without mercy for protocol violations. The cabin lights dimmed as Flight 4582 leveled off. A recorded voice invited passengers to sit back, relax, or work comfortably. The cabin's atmosphere softened into a muted hum, punctuated by the occasional clink of silverware or the rustle of newspapers. Caleb let out a quiet breath. He had done what he needed to do, but the journey was far from over. He was a boy, certainly, but also a symbol. Proof that one person, no matter their age, could hold that system accountable. A sparkle of pride flickered in his chest. His grandfather would be waiting at Dulles International, ready to greet him with that familiar half-smile and a nod that said, "Well done." Caleb's lips curved into a slight grin, not triumphant, but resolute. He leaned his head against the headrest and offered a silent thank you to the lessons he'd learned in quiet corners of Lincoln. That courage could take many forms, especially the kind that didn't make a sound. Outside the window, the sun climbed higher above the clouds, painting them in soft gold. Inside the cabin, Flight 4582 flew on, carrying a boy whose resolve had just shifted the power dynamics of an entire industry. And with every passing mile, that truth settled more firmly in Caleb's mind. Sometimes, the most profound change happens when you stand still in the face of injustice. Caleb watched the miles of sky stretch out beneath him, the endless pale blue broken only by wisps of cloud. He stared at the curve of his window, tracing its edges with a practiced calm. To most people, he was just another first-class passenger on Flight 4582 to Washington, D.C. But Caleb's mind was far from idle. He was already thinking through everything his grandfather had taught him about responsibility, privilege, and the delicate balance between patience and action. Back in Lincoln, Nebraska, Caleb Thornhill's life had always revolved around two constants: his late mother's gentle laugh and his grandfather's measured voice. After his mother passed away when Caleb was 9, an illness that struck too quickly, his world pivoted to the imposing cream-colored walls of the Nebraska State Capitol, where Governor George Thornhill presided over his final term. Caleb's father was overseas with the Army, so his grandfather became both mentor and guardian. Those afternoons in the Capitol's hallway, strolling beneath tall columns as journalists and constituents buzzed around them, Caleb learned that government was supposed to serve people, not power. He learned that watching from the sidelines was not enough. Sometimes, he would have to walk through the crowd and speak. When the invitation arrived, an embossed envelope announcing that he had been chosen to represent Nebraska in the National Youth Forum in Washington, D.C., Caleb felt a lump in his throat. This wasn't just any summer program. It was the culmination of everything he and his grandfather had talked about: policy, ethics, and the role young voices could play in shaping the future. He had spent months preparing, poring over statistics on youth voter turnout, drafting position papers on rural education funding, and memorizing quotes from historic Nebraskan legislators. His grandfather had watched him work nights in his home office, stacks of books, 2 monitors humming, without saying much, until the day he finally handed Caleb an envelope with a small card tucked inside. "Here," his grandfather said, voice soft. "You'll need this." On the card, printed in dark blue ink, was the logo for Clear Fly Anchor. In the top corner sat the crest of the National Passenger Trust Index. Only a handful of people in the entire country held this credential. And now, for the next 48 hours, Caleb did. It was part of a pilot program to test new safeguards for minors traveling alone. His grandfather, in his official capacity, had arranged a temporary delegate status for Caleb. The card allowed him to flag or override minor-related protocol violations in first-class cabins, technology that almost no one knew existed. Caleb remembered how he felt when he first read the card like a secret treasure map. He understood its weight. One wrong move could jeopardize an entire airline's access to federal funding. It was an enormous responsibility. But his grandfather had reminded him, it isn't just about holding power. It's about wielding it to protect the vulnerable. That was a lesson Caleb took seriously, but also with a pinch of awe. He was only 13, after all. Now, as Flight 4582 gained altitude, he recalled the moment his grandfather had handed him the boarding pass. "You'll fly under my name's courtesy," he'd said, handing Caleb a laminated badge with his mother's maiden name on it. "Let them see you for your own merit, not for mine." Caleb had nodded, heart racing with excitement. He was used to being one of the youngest kids in any room, but this was different. Here, he carried the weight of an entire legacy. Yet he also alone would need to prove himself. He tucked the small gray hoodie into his lap and caught sight of the navy blue blanket folded at his feet. The cabin's hush was almost meditative. A flight attendant moved quickly to distribute noise-canceling headphones, and a gentle chime signaled the drink service had begun. Caleb didn't need anything. He had waterproof packages of data and notes already open on his tablet, ready for the first of many policy debates he'd participate in during the forum. Still, he let the attendant set a water bottle on the small side table. The gesture was polite. He said, "Thank you," in a quiet voice. He had learned that politeness cost nothing but respect. The attendant glanced at his face, as though reassessing him now that his seat was secure. She offered a half-smile, then moved on. His thoughts drifted back to Lincoln's Sunday evenings, when his grandfather would settle in his leather armchair with 2 cups of mint tea. They would discuss everything from renewable energy subsidies to youth prison reform. Tonight, his grandfather was probably in that same chair, listening to coverage of Flight 4582 on Nebraska Public Radio, waiting for news to break about what his grandson had done. He recognized that as soon as the plane touched down in D.C., every news outlet from Omaha to Washington would be dissecting what had happened. He pulled up the National Youth Forum's website on his tablet. The first agenda item was a roundtable on student civic engagement. Next was a panel on educational equity, and then a breakout session on rural broadband access. Caleb had written 3 short speeches, each tailored for a specific panel. He refolded his grandfather's note, laminated with his grandfather's signature. "Caleb, remember, you are not just a delegate. You are a symbol of possibility. Let your work be louder than your words." He scrolled through photos of his mother, smiling as she clutched his hand in their home garden. He felt a twinge of longing. Tomorrow, he would step into a world without her, but in a way, by stepping into the public eye, he would carry her memory forward. His reverie ended when the cabin lights dimmed for the automatic in-flight safety demonstration. The captain's calm voice filled the overhead speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial climb to cruising altitude. Please ensure seatbelts remain fastened as the seatbelt sign is illuminated. We expect mild turbulence over the Rockies." Soft laughter rippled through the cabin at the thought of mild turbulence. But Caleb felt only a gentle swaying as the plane angled upward. He tucked his tablet into his lap. Soon enough, he had to decide what to do with the authority he held. The National Passenger Trust Index wasn't something to flaunt. It was an accountability measure in case things went sideways. But Harriet Stone's face lingered in his mind, her cold eyes, her dismissive nod as she called security. She had seen a child and assumed he didn't belong, even though his ticket was real. That simple act of erasure, seeing him as less, became the catalyst for everything that followed. He exhaled slowly. The sun, rising higher now, cast a golden glow across the horizon. He let himself feel a flicker of pride. He had honored his Grenache as Flight 4582 gained altitude. He recalled the moment his grandfather had handed him the boarding pass. "You'll fly under my name's courtesy," he'd said, handing Caleb a laminated badge with his mother's maiden name on it. "Let them see you for your own merit, not for mine." Caleb had nodded, heart racing with excitement. He was used to being one of the youngest kids in any room, but this was different. Here, he carried the weight of an entire legacy. Yet he also alone would need to prove himself in Father's trust. He had moved deliberately, not out of anger, but out of unwavering principle. It was often said that the true test of leadership was not how loudly you spoke, but how calmly you stood your ground. A gentle knock sounded at his elbow. Carlos, the young flight attendant, appeared again. "Mr. Thornhill, we're offering appetizers now, smoked salmon, or we have fresh fruit as well." Caleb offered a small, gracious smile. "Fruit, please." "Thank you." He glanced at the menu card, noting the descriptions but feeling uninterested. His mind was already plotting out the first debate question he'd pose at the forum. How can young people in rural communities exert influence on federal policy for funding and resources? He ate a few pieces of melon thoughtfully, the cool taste a quiet counterpoint to his buzzing thoughts. A couple of rows ahead, passengers were huddled close together, murmuring into their phones. He recognized bits of conversation. Thrown out of first class. Federal ethics override. 13-year-old boy. He leaned back, letting that hum of chatter wash over him. Still, in the midst of everything, Caleb felt an unusual calm. The boy who'd stepped onto the jet bridge just 30 minutes ago, a nervous, determined kid, had already proven something extraordinary. Sometimes, integrity spoke loudest when it was spoken without shouting. The in-flight crew dimmed the overhead lights further, and the service carts rolled away. A hush fell once more, broken only by the gentle drone of engines. Caleb reached into his pocket, touching the edge of the Clearfly anchor badge still tucked in his jacket. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly, letting the weight of what he'd done settle in his chest. Tomorrow, he'd walk into the National Youth Forum with thousands of eyes watching, but tonight, he would let the plane's gentle vibrations lull him into reflection. Because the reason he was on this flight, beyond representing Nebraska, was to carry forward his grandfather's legacy, one measured decision at a time. And in that clarity, he found a sense of peace. He drifted into a light reverie, imagining the Capitol steps in Washington and the room full of other youth poised to shape history. But for now, he simply let himself exist in this moment. Eyes closed, heart steady, prepared to face whatever came next. It wasn't about making a spectacle. It was about standing firm. And in his mind, that was more than enough. Caleb remained seated, heart pounding as Flight 4582 leveled off over Wyoming. The cabin lights dimmed for service, but his skin still prickled with the memory of Harriet Stone's glare. She'd taken his ticket, shredded it, and sent him to economy, all in front of a cabin full of business executives and federal aides. Now the muted drone of the engines couldn't muffle his rising discomfort. Harriet moved down the aisle, her posture rigid, a forced apology on her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, you'll need to gather your belongings and come with me," she said, voice low but sharp enough for nearby passengers to lean in and listen. She didn't call him Mr. Thornhill or Caleb. Just "Sir," as if he were some unruly toddler. Caleb inhaled slowly, recalling his grandfather's words, "Never let them see you bend." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the torn pieces of his boarding pass, smoothing them flat. Harriet kept her arm outstretched, as though she expected him to hand over some hidden proof. He clenched his jaw and slipped the scraps back into his pocket. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. A hush fell over the first-class cabin. The older couple across the aisle exchanged worried glances. A man in a charcoal suit leaned forward, whispering into his phone, "You're not going to believe this." His finger hovered over the record button. Caleb felt eyes on him from every direction. Admiration, disgust, pity. Carlos, the younger attendant, hovered nearby. "Everything okay?" he asked in a low voice. Caleb gave a curt nod. "Fine," he said, his tone measured. "I'll go." He rose, shoulders squared. The plush leather seat felt like a throne he was forced to abandon. Other passengers watched in silence as he collected his backpack and tablet. In that moment, any urge to argue flared and died in his throat. He let Harriet guide him into the economy cabin, her grip light but firm on his elbow. Once there, Caleb found a single empty middle seat toward the back. He sat, making no protest. His grandfather had taught him that real power didn't always roar. It was often quiet and steady. He'd wasted no time activating Clear Fly Anchor's override. Now, he'd let the system do the talking. Above him, First Class resumed the hushed rhythm of silverware and murmured apologies. He heard a man say, "I can't believe how they treated a child." Another voice whispered, "He's going to make them pay for that." Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, letting the gentle sway of the plane calm him. He remembered his grandfather's face when he'd handed Caleb the boarding pass and that Clear Fly card. He could almost hear that gravelly voice. "This is a test of who you are. Don't let spite push you off course." He opened his eyes to the narrow economy window, where clouds drifted by like quiet witnesses. A middle-aged woman in the row ahead met his gaze and offered a small, sympathetic smile. Caleb returned it, steadying himself. He was safe. He was right. He tapped his tablet, reviewing his presentation slides for the youth forum. Over the intercom, the captain's calm voice announced light turbulence ahead. Passengers tightened seatbelts, whispered, "Here we go," and braced for the bump. The subtle jolt felt like a reminder that life could be unsettled, but also that stability came from within. Caleb's phone vibrated in his pocket. He didn't need to check it. He knew his grandfather was monitoring the situation from Nebraska. He tapped the Clear Fly Anchor icon again, watching as the system quietly escalated his ethics breach, minor displacement, to a national alert. In under 50 seconds, clear alarms would ripple through air traffic control centers. But for now, he simply took a deep breath. He had survived a public humiliation, acted with restraint, and set the gears of a nationwide system in motion. As Flight 4582 cruised eastward, Caleb Thornhill sat in economy thinking, sometimes standing still is louder than screaming, and somewhere up ahead, the rest of the airline world was about to hear exactly how loud. Caleb pressed his back into the slim economy seat, eyes flicking to the small screen of his phone. In his hand lay the torn remnants of that first-class boarding pass. Proof not only that Harriet Stone had overstepped, but that he had every right to be where he was. He drew a slow breath and opened the Clear Fly Anchor app. The interface glowed softly, a deep blue background with a single button labeled Flag Minor Displacement. It was a quiet icon. No dramatic alarms, no flashing lights. Yet it represented the authority he carried. He tapped the button. A confirmation prompt appeared. Confirm Ethics Breach Report. Harriet Stone, Flight 4582, Gate 28, Denver International. Confirm. Cancel. He selected Confirm. Instantly, a discrete progress bar appeared, then faded. A single vibration signaled the report was live. He slipped his phone into his pocket, heart settling into a steady rhythm. Moments later, the first echo reached him through the cabin's barely perceptible hum, an overhead chime, and the softest murmur of voices. Flight attendants exchanged glances as a new alert flashed on their tablets. Urgent. Ethics verification required. Minor passenger displacement. Flight 4582. Await instructions. Carlos, the young attendant, paused mid-step. "Excuse me," he said to a colleague. "Did you just get—" The other attendant shook her head. "No idea, but keep an eye out." Caleb felt a thrill, part relief, part apprehension. The system was responding exactly as designed. He let his gaze drift to the flight deck, imagining the pilots receiving a flurry of red alerts. Somewhere behind them, air traffic controllers must be scrambling, rerouting, holding planes on taxiways. Back in the cabin, conversations softened. Passengers leaned forward, phones flicking to life. One businesswoman pulled her tablet from the seat pocket to check news apps. Another man whispered into his headset, his eyes widening. Across the aisle, an older gentleman muttered, "What on earth?" His wife reached over, tugging at his sleeve, but he barely noticed. He was glued to his phone screen. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear the distant hum of control towers acknowledging ethics reset requested signals. A series of commands would cascade through FAA systems. Check National Passenger Trust Index. Flight 4582 flagged for minor displacement violation. Then the bigger orders. Hold all affected flights until verification. Freeze gate assignments for non-compliant crew. Just then, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently holding at our assigned altitude due to an unexpected systems alert. We apologize for the delay and will update you as soon as possible. Thank you for your patience." Weak applause broke out, more a reflex than celebration. But to Caleb, it sounded like a standing ovation. He allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. His grandfather's face flashed through his mind, the crinkled kindness in his grandfather's eyes as he once said, "Power is nothing if you don't use it to protect what matters." He settled deeper into his seat. Around him, cabin crew moved with measured urgency, quietly checking seat belts and scanning phones for any incoming directives. An attendant from first class hurried past, whispering under her breath, "Ethics flag." Flight paused, FAA on it. She glanced directly at Caleb, her eyes a mix of embarrassment and awe. Caleb met her gaze, offering a small nod. No anger, just calm assurance. A few rows back, a young girl clutching a storybook leaned in toward her mother. "Mom, what's happening?" she asked, wide-eyed. The mother smiled softly. "Someone made sure justice was served," she whispered. "We'll find out soon." At that moment, the entire cabin felt suspended between two worlds. The steady hum of the engines and the ripple of an ethical earthquake set off by a 13-year-old boy. Caleb exhaled, tapping his temple. His grandfather's lessons had never felt more real. In one quiet gesture, one deliberate tap on an app, he had summoned the system to act on his behalf. It was not revenge. It was accountability. Outside the window, clouds drifted past like silent witnesses. Inside, Flight 4582 hovered in the sky, waiting. For clearance, for confirmation, but most of all, for conscience to catch up with protocol. And as the minutes ticked on, Caleb's phone vibrated in his pocket. He didn't need to check it. He knew his grandfather was monitoring the situation from Nebraska. He tapped the clear fly anchor icon again, watching as the system quietly escalated his ethics breach, minor displacement, to a national alert. In under 50 seconds, clear alarms would ripple through air traffic control centers. Leb Thornhill sat poised, knowing he had already changed the course of more than just one flight. As Flight 4582 settled into cruising altitude, Caleb pressed his phone back into his pocket and leaned forward slightly. Around him, the cabin had settled into a low murmur, laptops clicking, a child in the next row dozing, flight attendants quietly preparing mid-air service. But Caleb's world felt electric. He closed his eyes, recalling the exact moment his grandfather had pressed that clear fly anchor badge into his hand. Now, with Harriet Stone's insult still fresh, he tapped the icon one more time. The home screen faded into a simple confirmation prompt. National Passenger Trust Index, activate ethics override for Flight 4582. He exhaled, tapping confirm. Nearly instantaneously, his phone vibrated. On the screen, a discreet notification read, "Ethics breach acknowledged," followed by a short countdown. 06 Ontuquag to deactivation. That 6-minute window was all major air traffic control needed to reroute dozens of other flights and lock gate assignments. Caleb opened his eyes and glanced around. No one noticed anything overtly unusual, just a faint shift in the cabin's energy. He watched as a flight attendant 2 rows down received an alert on her tablet, her brow furrowing. In the aisle, another attendant passed on the message to the purser in a hushed tone 6 minutes later, marked by a gentle chime through the in-flight announcement system. A formal message appeared discreetly on every pilot's console in the domestic network. National Passenger Trust Index override in effect. Flight 4582 flagged for minor displacement. Hold all related departures. Immediately, radar screens in Denver, Chicago, and Atlanta displayed Flight 4582's call sign as the top priority. In the cabin, the change was subtle but undeniable. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Laptops in adjacent seats buzzed with notifications. A nearby businessman peered at his phone, mouthed, "Incredible," and furiously tapped his screen. Caleb felt a flush of calm triumph. He hadn't needed to shout or argue. He'd simply pushed a button, and a vast, nationwide system had listened. By the time his eyes closed again, shells of clouds drifted by beyond the window. Inside, Flight 4582 hovered in place, caught until ethics protocols were satisfied. One by one, those colored tracking blips across half the nation's airports froze. Caleb sat back, shoulders relaxed, as the cabin's low hum swelled into a collective awareness. An unseen hand had shifted the balance of power, validating a 13-year-old's claim to dignity. In that moment, he understood his grandfather's quiet pride and the true weight of wielding power with responsibility. By mid-morning, the ripple effects of Caleb's ethics override rippled far beyond Flight 4582. In Denver, the control tower screens glowed bright red as 152 flights blinked a steady hold beside their call signs. Pilots in cockpits tapped at their consoles, eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Below them, ground crews and gate agents scurried, ushering passengers back from jet bridges, calling for extra buses, and scrambling to rearrange connecting flights. It wasn't a simple delay. It was a full system freeze, a cascade triggered by one boy's quiet action. A few states northeast, at O'Hare International, 3 runways switched to priority ethical review status. One by one, gate assignments stalled. Digital boards flashed cautionary messages. In Chicago's bustling terminals, usually so efficient, travelers groaned as their screens displayed, "Delay, ethics check in progress." A suit-clad businessman, clutching a leather briefcase, looked around in disbelief, muttering to his assistant, "We've got to get to DC for the hearing." But for now, there was nothing to do but wait. Back on Flight 4582, Harriet Stone hovered by the first-class galley, eyes darting toward the cockpit door. She'd overheard the young attendant whisper, "National Passenger Trust Index override. Flight flagged." She felt a sudden jolt of panic as she realized this wasn't about seats anymore. It was about a national protocol no one wanted to mess with. In the cabin, whispers turned to murmurs. A woman 2 rows in front of Caleb typed furiously into her phone, live streaming the scene under the headline, "Denver boy stands up to flight attendant. Now he's halting 150-plus flights." Her followers had already spiked into the tens of thousands. Another passenger, a retired teacher, shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, as he recorded the exchanges on his tablet. Caleb watched all of it unfold with remarkable calm. He leaned forward slightly, mind tracing the steps his grandfather had mapped out. Choose your moment. Speak truth with action. He didn't clap or cheer. He simply observed. Through the tiny lens of his window, clouds drifted by as if they, too, were waiting for the outcome. Meanwhile, major news networks picked up the story. In Atlanta, scores of travelers at Hartsfield-Jackson looked up from their phones to realize their flights to Dallas, New York, and Miami had all vanished from the departure boards. A grizzled veteran pilot, waiting patiently at the gate, shook his head, muttering, "Never seen a kid do that." Down the concourse, a woman in an aisle seat scrolled social media and gasped at the headline, "Boy, 13, freezes 1.7 BB in flight funding." In Denver's airline boardroom, executives in crisp suits huddled around a table strewn with tablets and coffee cups. They brought up Flight 4582's designation: urgent, ethics override, minor displacement. The lead operations manager barked into his phone, "Get me someone at FAA, now!" He jabbed a finger at the screen, where Caleb's face, calm, resolute, filled the app's icon. He couldn't believe that a single boy held more operational sway than any of them. Back on the plane, a hush settled as the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for this unprecedented delay. Due to an ethics verification request, we must remain at cruising altitude until further notice. Thank you for your patience and understanding." A collective sigh swept through the cabin. Businessmen looked at their watches. A mother cradled her newborn, whispering in her ear, but all eyes kept flicking to Caleb, as though he were a silent conductor of this entire symphony of hold orders and redirected jetways. Harriet's shoulders sagged as she stepped into the galley. She found Carlos, who gave her a sympathetic shake of the head. "He did it," Carlos said quietly. "It's all on that boy." Harriet's throat tightened. She hadn't intended for things to escalate. All she'd wanted was to maintain proper protocol on her flight, until she realized that her protocol was exactly what he was correcting. In Chicago and Denver and Miami, control towers tapped their headsets, industry-wide protocols blinking red. Economists quickly ran numbers. $1.7 billion in federally allocated airport funding was in limbo until the FAA completed its ethics review. Headlines popped up. 1.7B, freeze. FAA responds to teen's ethics call. Air travel in turmoil. Nation watches young boy's victory. Sometime later, as late morning light angled through the cabin windows, an attendant slid a fresh bottle of water across from Caleb. He offered a small nod of thanks, folding his hands in his lap. Passengers around him relaxed slightly, some relieved to finally move beyond shock into conversation. But they all knew this flight was different. They had witnessed institutional power bend in the face of a single, principled act. High above the Rockies, Flight 4582 became the epicenter of a story about dignity, accountability, and the surprising way a child's resolve could rewire a nation's airspace. In those quiet moments, the cabin of Flight 4582 felt less like an aircraft and more like a gathering of witnesses, watching as one boy's calm conviction rippled outward to transform the entire system. And as travel along America's crowded corridors ground to a halt, Caleb Thornhill sat poised, knowing he'd redefined what it meant to be young, empowered, and unbowed. Down on the tarmac at Denver, handlers scrambled to shuttle passengers off grounded jets. In the operations control room, screens showed "Ethics Override" in bold red across multiple flight paths. Executives in sharp suits huddled around tablet displays, calling FAA contacts and muttering, "How do we get this lifted?" The lead operations manager jabbed at his tablet, eyes narrowing on Caleb's face in the ClearFly Anchor app. The boy who'd single-handedly disrupted $1.7 billion in airport funding. Back on Flight 4582, the cabin's quiet tension deepened. Carlos moved methodically down the aisle, offering water and low reassurances. The businessman who'd recorded the entire exchange tapped his phone, eyes focused on streaming headlines. 13-year-old triggers national ethics review. A retired colonel in the seat behind whispered into a fellow passenger's ear, "I've seen a lot in my day. Never anything like this." Up in the cockpit, the captain exchanged a grim nod with his co-pilot. Their primary focus? Keep Flight 4582 safely in position until FAA clearance arrived. The priority ethical review notice on their screens meant every ground controller, dispatcher, and policy official was monitoring that single call. Meanwhile, in Nebraska, Governor George Thornhill scanned live maps with the state's chief of staff. "He did exactly what we practiced," the governor said quietly. "Let the system do the talking." As they watched hundreds of flights stand down across the Midwest, the governor tapped his fingers on the desk, pride softening the lines in his face. His grandson's restraint, and that one decisive tap on the ClearFly Anchor app, had proven more powerful than any speech. Inside the cabin, the murmurs died down as passengers realized they'd witnessed something historic. A young boy's dignity had forced an entire industry to pause and rethink its priorities. And for a moment, up at 35,000 feet, Flight 4582 felt less like an airplane and more like the world's focal point for a national reckoning in ethics. The moment Flight 4582 touched down back at Denver's gate, Harriet Stone was escorted off by two senior managers. She wasn't taken to the passenger lounge or a quiet break room. Instead, she was led straight into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the tarmac. Inside, airline executives, legal counsel, and a representative from the FAA waited. On the table, 3 tablets showed the same looping video. Harriet ripping Caleb's first-class boarding pass and ordering him to economy. Harriet stood rigid as the head of in-flight services, a woman named Marissa Clark, pressed play. The silent cabin, the shredded ticket fluttering to the floor. Caleb's unmoving gaze. It was all there for everyone to see. "That is you," Clark said softly but firmly. "And because of that action, the FAA has opened a formal investigation into your conduct." Harriet's face paled. "Listen, she began, but Clark cut in. "Be quiet." Meanwhile, back in the terminal, passengers who'd been on Flight 4582 clustered around charging stations and kiosks, screens lighting up with news alerts. A retired teacher from first class, sipping coffee at a cafe, tapped out a statement on her phone. She looked at him like he was disposable. Within minutes, that quote, paired with the clip, was trending on social media under #Thornhill Effect. A business journalist live-streamed commentary. "A 13-year-old boy has forced a nationwide ethics review, and now we have video of how it all started. Tell me, have you ever seen anything like it?" Inside the conference room, FAA investigator Linda Chu leaned forward, steepling her fingers. "We've gathered statements from multiple passengers. Several corroborate that Ms. Stone questioned Caleb not for any security concern, but simply because of his age. That is discriminatory, and it falls under Federal Aviation Regulation 14 CFR Part 382, Non-Discrimination in Air Travel." Harriet swallowed, glancing at her tablet where the FAA's Notice of Inquiry flashed. Inquiry #DEN 4582-2025. Alleged minor passenger displacement. Her managers exchanged grim looks. She was required to submit a written statement by tomorrow morning, and the FAA could revoke her credentials pending the outcome. A hush fell as a young flight attendant, Carlos, entered and quietly set down a fresh coffee before Harriet. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "They're using your heart rate monitor from the flight's health data. It shows you were at 132 BPM when you tore that ticket." The room tensed. Evidence that could only have come from the airline's own systems. Harriet's eyes flicked back to the video where Caleb's calm stare cut through the frame. She exhaled and nodded. No one forced her to speak, but now the world was watching. A single act, captured on camera, had ignited an industry-wide reckoning. And in this glass-walled room, there was no place left to hide. Crackling fluorescent lights filled the spacious lobby of a Denver hotel that afternoon. Reporters milled around, their cameras and microphones poised like battalions waiting for orders. People held placards reading "Justice for Caleb" and "Ethics over Entitlement." But most simply clutched smartphones, ready to live stream any developments. The atmosphere felt electric. Denver had never been a national news epicenter until a 13-year-old boy stopped $1.7 billion in airport funding by tapping a single button. Now, Governor George Thornhill arrived, flanked by a small entourage, a sharp-suit civil rights attorney named Michael Reynolds, and 2 aides carrying neatly bound packets of briefing materials. Caleb stood off to the side, staring at the mirrored walls as he tugged at his shirt collar. He had emerged from economy earlier, quietly, without fanfare, so that his grandfather could present him alongside a podium draped with an Ethics in Air Travel banner. The governor nodded at Caleb, offering a reassuring half-smile. Michael Reynolds closed his briefing folder and tapped a pen against his notepad. "You ready for this?" Reynolds asked. Caleb took a deep breath. "I think so," he said, voice low but steady. "It's just a lot of people." Michael patted his shoulder. "A lot of people who needed to hear you." At precisely 2:00 p.m., the ballroom doors swung open. Governor Thornhill stepped up to the podium, gazing out across a sea of cameras, bright lights reflecting off polished lenses. The click of shutters felt deafening in Caleb's ears. Behind him, the airline executives who had forced Harriet Stone to admit wrongdoing earlier that morning watched from a roped-off VIP section, white faces etched with anxiety. Governor Thornhill cleared his throat. "Good afternoon," he began, voice rich and resonant. "I'm George Thornhill, former governor of Nebraska. I'm here today to speak not only as a grandfather, but as a citizen concerned about the fundamental rights of every passenger, especially minors, who fly on our nation's airlines." He paused, eyes sweeping the room. "My grandson, Caleb, a 13-year-old representing Nebraska at the National Youth Forum in Washington, D.C., was publicly humiliated on Flight 4582 because he dared to occupy the seat he and his family had paid for. That simply cannot stand." A ripple of murmurs followed his words. Flashbulbs popped as he continued. "In a country built on principles of fairness and equality, no child should be told they do not belong simply because of their age." Caleb did not respond with anger or defiance. Instead, he used the tools available to him, which his grandfather arranged not as a privilege to be flaunted, but as a responsibility to be used judiciously. His action forced a national reckoning. His integrity forced us all to ask, what does it mean to treat every passenger with dignity and respect? As cameras swiveled toward Caleb, Governor Thornhill stepped aside. Caleb drew in a firm breath, raising the microphone. "I don't want to see anyone else go through what I did," he said, voice calm. "We all deserve to be treated with courtesy. I was just flying to D.C. for a summer program. I wasn't causing trouble. But when I was treated like I didn't matter, I remembered what Grandpa said. Stand your ground when you're right." I tapped the app and the system paused. I never thought in a million years it would go that far. All I did was stand still. A palpable hush fell. Reporters hastily scribbled notes. "Teen says he's just stood still in face of injustice." One cameraman leaned forward. "Caleb, do you think you did the right thing?" The teenager nodded. "Yes, because this isn't about me. It's about making sure airlines treat kids fairly. If I can help protect other kids from being humiliated, then it's worth it." Governor Thornhill reclaimed the podium. "In light of this incident, the Federal Aviation Administration has agreed to a temporary suspension of funding to any airline that fails to comply with a new set of guidelines we will submit today. Specifically, we are calling for an immediate amendment to Federal Aviation Regulation 14 CFR Part 382 to include a provision protecting minors from unjustly displaced seating. Effective today, the FAA will conduct a comprehensive ethics review of all carriers, modeled after the National Passenger Trust Index pilot. Caleb's action has made it imperative that we codify clear protections for every child traveling alone." A representative from the FAA, Deputy Administrator Laura Simmons, stepped forward, her presence immediately commanding attention. Tall and composed, Simmons tapped the microphone. "Governor Thornhill, thank you for highlighting this important issue. The FAA is committed to ensuring all passengers, regardless of age, are treated with respect. Effective immediately, we will place a hold on funding to any carrier under investigation for minor displacement violations. We also invite Caleb to testify before Congress next week to share his perspective on how this policy can be refined. The Thornhill Charter, a working title for these amendments, will mandate that no minor be moved from a valid seat without a verified security or safety concern. We will issue a formal notice to all carriers by Friday. Reporters erupted in questions. Will existing seating policies change overnight? Can you guarantee airlines will comply? Ms. Simmons, what about carriers who resist? Will there be fines? Simmons nodded methodically. Any carrier found in breach will be subject to penalties, including suspension of funding and potential civil penalties. We are serious about this. A camera cut to an on-screen ticker. FAA announces Thornhill Charter to protect minor passengers. As deputy and governor exited the stage, Michael Reynolds guided Caleb away from the melee. "You did it," Reynolds said softly. "You changed federal policy at 13. Caleb looked up at his grandfather, tears of pride glistening in the governor's eyes. "I just stood still," he whispered with a shy grin. Outside, crowds had gathered beneath giant screens broadcasting the live feed. Strangers cheered and applauded. A father lifted his young daughter onto his shoulders, pointing at the screen. "That's the boy who made it fair for kids like you, sweetheart." The girl's eyes widened with wonder. In the hotel lobby, airline executives regrouped, faces pale and uncertain. They knew the game had changed. A single principled act by a child had forced them into a corner. Now they had to prove they could live up to the new standard. For Caleb Thornhill, the rest of the afternoon was a blur of handshakes, waves, and whispered congratulations. He felt tired but resolute. He had flown to DC to speak at a forum. Instead, he'd rewritten an industry's code of ethics. And as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, he realized, sometimes, standing still is the loudest statement you can make. The marble floors of the Rayburn House office building gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights as aides hustled in wool coats carrying binders stuffed with briefing memos. In room 2154, a dozen members of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure sat behind a long, elevated dais. Nameplates read, Congresswoman Maria Santos, Congressman David Kim, and Chairman Richard Porter. At precisely 10 o'clock a.m., the gavel pounded, and the hearing began. "Good morning," Chairman Porter said, eyes sweeping the crowded room. "We are convened today to examine Federal Aviation Administration protocols regarding non-discrimination and the rights of minor passengers. Our witness is Mr. Caleb Thornhill, who, despite being only 13 years old, sparked a national ethics review in air travel. We will also hear from FAA Deputy Administrator Laura Simmons and representatives from Atlantic Global Airways. The floor is open." Whispers rippled among reporters and staffers. In the front row of the audience section, Governor George Thornhill nodded at his grandson, who sat composed, hands folded on the mahogany table. Caleb adjusted the microphone. He wore a dark blazer over a white-collared shirt, grown up enough to command respect, but still young enough to reveal faint traces of freckles. Caleb cleared his throat. "Thank you, Chairman Porter, and thank you, members of the committee," he began. His voice was steady, measured, without a hint of adolescent hesitation. "On June 2, 2025, I boarded Flight 4582 from Denver to Washington, D.C., in first class with a valid ticket. When the flight attendant, Ms. Harriet Stone, publicly tore my boarding pass and insisted I move to economy, despite my grandfather's payment and my need to prepare for the National Youth Forum, I used the Clearfly Anchor's National Passenger Trust Index override as my recourse." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. That one action froze 152 flights, triggered a $1.7 billion ethics review, and ultimately led to this committee hearing today. Clipboards rattled as committee members exchanged glances. Congresswoman Santos adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Thornhill, how did you feel in that moment?" she asked. Caleb met her gaze. "I was embarrassed and angry, but I remembered my grandfather's words. Sometimes, standing still is louder than screaming. I wanted to protect my dignity, yes, but also ensure no other minor would suffer the same humiliation. He leaned forward. I didn't seek attention. I sought accountability. A hush fell over the room. Below the dais, radio microphones clicked as reporters captured every syllable. In the witness gallery, passengers from Flight 4582, a retired colonel, a marketing executive, even the elderly Pearsons, watched silently. Some nodded in agreement. Others appeared uneasy, recalling their own roles in the ordeal. Next, FAA Deputy Administrator Laura Simmons approached the lectern. She offered a respectful nod to Chairman Porter and the committee. Good morning. The FAA recognizes that Flight 4582's events revealed a critical flaw in our policies concerning minor passengers. Effective immediately, we propose the Thornhill Charter, an amendment to 14 CFR Part 382. Under this charter, carriers receiving federal funding must adhere to the following provisions. Seat protection for minors. No passenger under 18 possessing a valid ticket may be relocated from their seat without documented security or safety concerns. Enhanced ethics monitoring. All airlines must implement real-time ethics audits via the National Passenger Trust Index or equivalent system. Any flagged minor displacement triggers an immediate operational hold until verified. Public reporting requirements. Carriers are required to publicly disclose, on a quarterly basis, any ethics flags and resolution outcomes, ensuring transparency. She cleared her throat. These measures will be codified in the Federal Register by next week. Non-compliance will result in suspension of federal grants, civil penalties up to $5 million per violation, and potential revocation of operating certificates. A murmur swept through the gallery. Representative Kim scribbled notes, impressed by the specificity. The chairman nodded. Deputy Administrator Simmons, will this apply to all airports, including those currently under upgrade contracts? He asked. Simmons met his gaze. Yes, sir. Any airport receiving federal funds for construction, expansion, or modernization must demonstrate compliance with these ethics provisions to secure continued funding. She tapped a tablet showing a map with highlighted airports in Texas, Colorado, and Illinois. We are already collaborating with Denver International, O'Hare, and Hartsfield-Jackson to integrate ethics audit modules into their ground control systems by the end of July. In the audience, a small group wearing ethics over entitlement pins applauded softly. Caleb allowed himself a brief, satisfied smile before turning back to the camera banks. He felt his heart swell at the sight of his grandfather, white hair still neat, eyes gleaming with pride. The final witness was the CEO of Atlantic Global Airways, Lawrence Phillips, escorted by legal counsel. He stepped forward with a measured expression. Members of the committee, Atlantic Global recognizes the significance of this moment. We have withdrawn Ms. Harriet Stone from flight duty effective immediately, pending a complete internal review. We support the FAA's proposed amendments and will allocate $50 million toward ethics training and system upgrades across all our domestic and international fleets. A reporter in the back row whispered, "Did he just say $50 million?" Caleb tuned out the buzzing and focused on his next mission, asking the CEO a pointed question. "Mr. Phillips," he said, voice calm but firm. "If Atlantic Global's profits depend on maintaining high passenger volumes, how will you ensure that the push for revenue doesn't override these new ethics standards?" Phillips paused, then nodded. "Young man, we will implement third-party audits overseen by a non-profit ethics council. Should any airline executive or staff member violate protocols, we will enforce immediate disciplinary action, up to termination. We cannot compromise on this." The chairman's gavel tapped. "Thank you, Mr. Phillips." He turned to Caleb. "Any final remarks, Mr. Thornhill?" Caleb inhaled. "Yes, Chairman. This isn't just a policy fix, it's a cultural shift. We must teach every flight attendant and passenger that dignity isn't negotiable. Every child deserves respect. If we do this right, we'll not only protect minors, but set a precedent for accountability whenever anyone's rights are threatened." Silence followed, then a smattering of applause. Cameras flashed as Caleb stepped away, his face a blend of relief and resolve. He shook hands with his grandfather, who murmured, You changed the system, son. Caleb nodded, humbly accepting the praise. Outside, protesters cheered, and newscasters broke into exclamation. Thornhill Charter passes its first major hurdle. In Denver, airport operations resumed as ethics integration teams swapped out software modules. Across the country, airport managers began retooling gate assignments and training protocols. Caleb knew this was more than a single victory. It was an invitation for every carrier, every traveler, and every policymaker to hold themselves to a higher standard. And as protocols updated in control towers and pilot consoles, he felt a quiet satisfaction that his generation, beginning with a 13-year-old boy in a simple hoodie, had turned a moment of public humiliation into a blueprint for universal respect. In the days that followed, newspaper editorials reflected on a new truth. Real power sometimes comes from standing still and refusing to cede space, even when the world expects you to. And in that, Caleb Thornhill's legacy took flight, soaring above the clouds on wings of integrity and change. Nearly a month had passed since Flight 4582's drama, and Caleb Thornhill found himself back at Denver International Airport, this time in the correct first-class line, boarding a flight to Washington, D.C. His reflection flickered across the polished glass wall as he walked toward Gate 14. Gone was the tension that had shadowed his previous trip. In its place, a quiet confidence settled in his chest. He smoothed the crease in his navy blazer, a small concession to looking official, as his grandfather liked to remind him. A flight attendant intercepted him before he reached the counter. Her name tag read Diana Wilson, and she offered a warm, genuine smile. Diana was Atlantic Global's newly appointed chief flight attendant, the first black woman to hold the position. She'd been one of the first to receive the airline's revamped ethics training, and Caleb had heard whispered praise of her leadership at both cabin and corporate levels. "Mr. Thornhill," she said, her tone respectful, "it's good to see you again. We've updated our boarding procedures. No one will question your ticket today." She scanned his pass without a second glance at his hoodie and handed it back. "Have a pleasant flight." He nodded, grateful. "Thank you, Ms. Wilson." "Call me Diana," she replied smoothly. "Enjoy your flight." As Caleb proceeded down the jet bridge, he noticed something striking. The flight attendants he encountered were noticeably more diverse than before. Several were black or brown, others Asian or Hispanic. A mosaic of faces that reflected the millions of passengers who flew Atlantic Global each year. It was a subtle yet powerful testament to the airline's commitment to change. At the aircraft door, Captain Williams stood waiting. He gave a small salute. "Mr. Thornhill," he greeted. "Good to have you back on board. How have you been?" "Doing well, sir," Caleb said. He reached a hand out, and the captain shook it firmly. "Thank you for everything." Williams smiled, a crease forming at the corner of his eye. "You set a new standard here. We're still working on full implementation, but the progress has been remarkable." He nodded toward the galley. "Diana will make sure your trip is smooth. If you need anything, let me know." Caleb settled into seat 1A, a window view over the Rockies. He tapped his phone to a news alert. "Harvard Business School adds Thornhill Charter case to CSR curriculum," read the headline. Beneath it, a subheading noted that several major carriers, including United and Southwest, had adopted versions of the Thornhill Protocol after seeing Atlantic Global's success. A quick scroll revealed that 15 airport authorities had begun installing ethics monitoring panels akin to ClearFly Anchor's interface in control towers, and 2 other airlines had publicly credited Caleb's case as the impetus for their new diversity and inclusion-focused flight attendant training. Caleb felt a familiar tug in his chest, the pride of knowing that his small act had catalyzed system-wide change. A flight attendant appeared with a courtesy water bottle and a laminated brochure. The brochure's title read, "Your Rights as a Minor Passenger," the Thornhill Charter explained. It outlined bullet points such as, "Valid ticket minors cannot be moved except for documented safety or security reasons. Real-time ethics audits via ClearFly Anchor or equivalent systems. Quarterly public reporting of seat reassignment incidents. He tucked the brochure into his backpack for later reference. As the safety demonstration began, he gazed out the window at the sprawling runway below. The plane taxied, and he recalled the first time he'd boarded Flight 4582, the way Harriet Stone had torn his ticket and the hush that followed. Now, the same cabin hummed with activity but carried a different undertone. Quiet assurance that the airline's crew would honor every passenger's dignity. A few minutes later, during the final boarding call, Caleb noticed an elderly white couple approach the gate. He recognized them immediately. The Pearsons, the same couple whose demands had triggered the original confrontation. Their faces looked strained. The woman's hands clenched a single economy boarding pass, while her husband clasped a small first-class permit. When they reached Diana, she greeted them politely. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Pearson. Welcome back." Mrs. Pearson's lip quivered. We'd like to sit together, please." Diana offered a calm nod. "Of course. I see you purchased economy for the first leg, but I have a seat available in first class for you. Complimentary. My apologies for any confusion. Would you like me to escort you there?" Mr. Pearson glanced at his wife, whose eyes brimmed with tears, part relief, part embarrassment. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Yes, please." An attendant led them past Caleb's row, and he watched as Mrs. Pearson took her seat, visibly humbled. In the seat she'd once tried to claim for Caleb, she paused, looked back, and mouthed, "I'm sorry." Caleb gave her a small nod. No resentment, only quiet acknowledgement that she'd learned a painful lesson. As the Pearsons settled, another flight attendant approached a young black woman wearing a business suit. "Ms. Washington, we've upgraded you to first class, complimentary, for your comfort." The woman's eyes widened. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I appreciate it." It was Zoe Washington, a former marketing executive Caleb had met on his first flight. Now she was headed to DC for a conference, and Atlantic Global had recognized her as an important voice in their diversity committee. When Zoe reached Caleb's row, she offered a conspiratorial grin. "Hey kid, I guess they remembered you gave them a masterclass on unconscious bias." Caleb laughed softly. "They're doing better than just remembering." He gestured to Diana. "Look at them. It's like a whole new world in here." Zoe nodded. "I've been working with them to ensure these upgrades aren't just PR stunts. We're putting metrics in place, tracking how many children got moved or offered seats. It's actually saving them money by reducing customer service issues." Before either could say more, the chief flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Flight 4723 to DC is now boarding. Please fasten your seatbelts, and we'll be wheels up in 5 minutes. Thank you for choosing Atlantic Global." The engines roared as the plane lifted off. Caleb felt the gentle surge in his seat, a familiar reminder of how far things had come. He slid his phone back into his pocket and exhaled, letting the moment sink in. Midway through the flight, a light knock came at his shoulder. Captain Williams, in uniform, stood in the aisle. "Mr. Thornhill, would you mind joining me in the cockpit for a moment? I'd like you to meet the co-pilot." Curious, Caleb rose and followed him forward. In the cockpit, the co-pilot, Lieutenant Maria Chavez, a decorated former Air Force pilot, smiled as she tapped a few controls. "Caleb, it's an honor to have you here," she said. "Your story is required reading at the Academy now. I've trained on how to handle ethics overrides. It's an incredible tool." The captain nodded. "We've already integrated the ethics monitoring module into our standard operating procedure. See these displays?" He pointed to a small screen labeled NPINDEX. "If any flight attendant flags a minor displacement, it goes here first. It locks out gate assignments, runway clears, everything. We can't move until the situation is resolved." Caleb peered at the screen. It showed a steady green bar under Flight 4723, indicating no issues. "So, I'm the first to have used this override," he said quietly. "Actually, no," Maria replied. "You're the first public case, but there was a test run last month with a minor in Philadelphia. No one knew about it. They handled it discreetly and resolved it. But yours set the standard. Direct line to the FAA and Congress. The plane leveled off, and Caleb turned back to the aisle. "I'm glad it's not just about me," he muttered. Captain Williams reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Your voice matters, Caleb. You reminded all of us why we started flying in the first place. Connection. Taking that away, by moving a kid because you think he doesn't belong, was never part of the plan. Thanks to you, we're closer to the truth." Caleb nodded, absorbing the gravity of their words. "Thank you, Captain." As he returned to his seat, Zoe slipped in beside him, peeking out at clouds drifting below. Tonight, Atlantic Global's board voted to share their entire ethics training curriculum with 3 other major carriers, she whispered. "They said you earned that kind of trust." Caleb's eyes widened. "They did that today?" "Yep," Zoe confirmed. "Maybe one day, there'll be no flight attendant or passenger who thinks keeping a kid in his seat is optional. That's the long game." He smiled, leaning his head back. Outside the window, the sky turned a soft pink as the sun set over the plains. Inside, Flight 4723 offered a tranquil cabin bathed in golden light, an environment born of accountability and respect. In that moment, a 13-year-old boy's quiet resolve had evolved into a movement, rippling through cockpits, boardrooms, and classrooms. And as the plane neared D.C., Caleb Thornhill closed his eyes and simply sat still. It was, he realized, louder than any shout, and its echo would carry far beyond the clouds.